a couple of disclaimers to start with, probably not unexpected. The first is it's not really a paper so much as a bunch of pretty slides put together. So it's not how I would normally present a paper, and it's not how art historians normally present papers. And I'm saying this because I remember as a postgraduate being at a historians and archaeologists dominated conference, and we noticed that all the art historians were on Friday night after dinner was when the papers were. And so when one of us asked, a very well-known art historian, or historian rather, replied, well, you guys are the amusement, the entertainment, at which point I thought my head was going to blow up. However, this time I am the entertainment. And that's kind of the attitude that I've taken with this. I thought about sort of rehashing an old paper that's already published, or a couple of old papers, and while I'll do part of that, I'm also going to engage in wild speculation and say things like, isn't that beautiful? So therefore confirming stereotypes of art historians. So that's not what I normally do, I hope. It's also just such a pleasure to talk about my favorite manuscript, the Corbie Psalter, which I think never gets the attention that it deserves. I think there should be monograph after monograph on this absolutely intriguing Psalter, and there's very little. So I think just the fact that you'll get to see these images, hopefully, even if I say nothing worthwhile, it'll give you something to think about and look at and maybe consider in your own work. So another disclaimer, art historians have now pretty much, most of us, moved away from the Darwinian model of an evolution of art history. And I was a bit shocked by a couple of things in last night's talk, including the term an evolution of manuscripts, which we try to kind of steer clear from, mainly because we've screwed it up so badly, if you'll excuse my colloquialism. So these are the various models, and I highly recommend Larry Neese's fantastic article, Recent Trends in Dating Works of Insular Art, in 2011, where he points out all of the problems with this model, especially the fact that it's largely based on, thank goodness we have a date for Lindisfarne 698, which, as you all know, is problematic. Also, other things that have put spanners in the works are this rather glamorous shot of Martin Gurr, which I have stays with him for the rest of his life, and another glamorous shot of the Staffordshire Horde, both beauties in their own right. We go further, but we'll stop. So these have obviously disrupted these chains of influence that we often talk about, and pointed out that not only can we can't really base our chronologies entirely on art historical models, and when we do, we need to be very, very careful. But even also when we talk about things like influence, shared characteristics, we also need to have a great deal of care, and all of that's been pointed out by people much better at doing it than me, but I think it's worth remembering. The other thing that, as a student, always struck me was Arculf and his luggage. It seemed like whenever we discussed the Book of Kells, there was always someone in the room who said, well, perhaps a Byzantine icon was with Arculf when he was shipwrecked. And that's how the influence came to Iona. Or perhaps he had a Carolingian ivory with his Byzantine icon, and perhaps a Sasanian piece of sculpture as well. These suitcases got bigger and bigger, and as many of you know, we now recently have come to the stunning, sad conclusion that perhaps Arculf and all of his luggage never really existed. So all of these things are throwing questions up that we need to confront. So it's with all that caution that I sort of approach the old art historical slide exam. Identify, date, compare, and contrast image A and B. And I'm going to try a little bit of that today, but also to kind of try to highlight the problems with that approach. So image B, I hope you all probably recognize, is the St. Andrew's sarcophagus. How many of you did not recognize that? Yes! Sally had blocked it from her memory. And how many of you recognize the Corbie Psalter? Seen it? Know it? A couple? Yes, some very well. How many of you have never seen this manuscript before? Okay, so I'm doing my job. It's all fine. We're entertained. We're seeing new things. So where is the Corbie Psalter from? If, like me, you come from an American background with no geography, this is Corbie, just outside of Amiens, which I cannot pronounce very well, but there it is. It is somewhere that has a lot of Irish connections, and then we think nobody has tried to date it in recent years, and I am certainly not the person to do it. It's usually given the date circa 800, or sometimes referred to as around the same date as the Book of Kells. So you have that kind of nebulous dating. This is what it looks like. It is a Carolingian manuscript. It's got very proper, recognizable script that you would expect from the Corbie sort of area. But, and there's a lot of classicizing influences, which are pretty obvious classicizing characteristics, but there are an awful lot of insular characteristics in the illumination. And this has kind of caused people to sort of pause to their thought. And hopefully you can also see within just these 2 pages that I've selected, there's also a huge range of style going on. This is an artist or 2. If it's 2, they're working very, very closely, who are very comfortable moving in a relatively small manuscript from one style to another, even on the same page, which is quite fascinating. The other thing about the Corbie Psalter that I love is it's a bit of an oddball. It doesn't quite fit in with the rest of the sort of Carolingian, Merovingian psalters. And I will say that, but then also pause to say we don't have many left to choose from. So I think saying, oh, isn't this unique, isn't this special, when there's only a handful that really have this level of illumination, we have to, again, be relatively careful. But what I did want to point out is there are some critical differences that suggest an insular approach to illumination. And I think this is, again, a shift in art history that's happened, that we're no longer looking just for style characteristics, but also the way you approach an image, the way that the image functions. So, for example, in the Utrecht Psalter, what I noticed is not only do you have these massive crowds of people engaging in different activities, they're also very warlike, but they tend to be running from war and battle, and it's usually the evil people who've got weapons. So there's this kind of constant play of people being victim, and it's only once in a while that God will sort of step in and arm his people, but for the most part they're unarmed and they're fleeing. This is even more exaggerated in the other well-known example from the continent in terms of a psalter. The Stuttgart Psalter, it's only when you flip through the entire thing that you realize how many people are running for their lives in this Psalter. It seems like they're running just across the pages, and you turn and they're still running. And they're always fleeing, and it's always the good man who's fleeing and being pursued, and he's unarmed, and he's being persecuted. And again, you get these large crowd scenes. In the Corbie Psalter, on the other hand, you have a much more insular take on the spiritual battle. It is usually singular, so it's usually one individual, perhaps 2 at the most, and instead of engaging with another human figure, they're most frequently fighting serpentine beasts and creatures. And again, this is something that we find a lot in Pictish art, and it's certainly something that occurs regularly in the Pictish, or in the Corbie Psalter. The other interesting thing is that the good people are armed, and I think armor here is very much a metaphor for faith. And also what's interesting is there's a tendency to project into the future, whereas the Utrecht Psalter and the Stuttgart Psalter, you see people being killed, being chased, the action is happening. In the Corbie Psalter, it's always about to happen, but it points out that yes, this man's about to suffer because a big serpent is going to eat him. But as that serpent goes down to bite this figure, it's going to impale itself on his sword. So it points to a sort of future salvation. If you stay steady in your faith, you will be saved. You don't need to flee. But also just this conversion to a sort of one-to-one combat. And by incorporating beasts rather than human figures, it very clearly delineates it as being along a sort of personal, spiritual battle, rather than couching it in these sort of broader military and perhaps secular terms. In terms of the Corbie Psalter, it's been described as having a diversity of Byzantine, Merovingian, and insular sources, the latter influence deriving from Irish missionary activity in the area from the 6th century onwards. Now, while this, I think, categorization of what's going on is very true, I don't think the Irish emphasis is necessarily right, and I have a huge amount of respect for Bernard Meehan, who wrote that. And he's a Scot, I might say, from Portobello. But I think this sort of Irish emphasis doesn't necessarily have to be there. It has these characteristics: Byzantine, insular, Merovingian, Carolingian, and probably Sasanian. And I'd say, where else do we get that? Well, the St. Andrew's sarcophagus is a good parallel. So this is where I mean they're friends. They have things in common, and maybe by probing those commonalities, we'll walk away with a better understanding of both manuscript, or of both objects. However, I would stop to say I think the insular, and I'm not the first to say it, influences Irish, Mercian, Northumbrian, and maybe Pictish or Scottish if we use that term very broadly. And I certainly think we could pull in the St. Andrew's sarcophagus as having shared common characteristics with this manuscript. Most of all, in terms of the seamless way that it moves from very natural classicized style into a much more abstract style of animal interlace. But one of the real interesting parallels is the way that those interlaced animals are still fleshy, and they still have depth and a certain roundness. And we find this in the Corbie Psalter as well, but also the same exotic creatures, the griffin, the intertwined beasts, the horseback rider, and the parallel with David and the lion I'll show you shortly. But there are a lot of common characteristics between these manuscripts and sarcophagus. And I'll just throw these up. These are all three initials from the Corbie Psalter, probably by the same artist. And again, you can see, just like with the St. Andrew's sarcophagus, this is someone who moves from a sort of classical, naturalized Carolingian style into a more kind of interlace style, into animal interlace, and back again. This is someone who's very well versed in jumping about. The other thing about the Corbie Psalter that I'll just point out is that it also is one of the rare manuscripts that still has the color quite well preserved. However, it was painted over. So some of the initials, the ones that are very bright purple and green, that's an artist who's gone over this much later and sort of painted the manuscript. But the palette is very Mercian or English, I would say, in terms of the colors. It's not that Irish or not that much like the Book of Kells, if you want to go that way. However, the parallel that was first noted many, many years ago and has been pulled out very nicely by Bernard Meehan, you can see it is mainly in the decorated initials. That the one on the right is from the Book of Kells, and the one on the left is from the Corbie Psalter. So hopefully you guys can see that. That's a very close match. The closest match, really, in terms of shared characteristics, is the Vespasian Psalter. And again, when we're trying to find a close match for the St. Andrew's sarcophagus, the Vespasian Psalter is brought forward. So it just seems to me more and more as I look at these objects that the St. Andrew's sarcophagus, the products coming out of England and Mercia, but also some of the Scottish products, like the Nig Cross Slab and the St. Andrew's sarcophagus, have so many shared characteristics that someone needs to, I think, kind of rethink all of this and possibly go back and sort of try to make more sense out of it. So just show you, I think most of these you'll know, the example from Breedon on Hill, the Lichfield angel, which has just recently been discovered, and David from our sarcophagus. Hopefully you can see how well this Scottish example works with these English examples in terms of style, movement, the delicacy of the drapery, things I normally don't ever talk about, that art historians are supposed to talk about. Hopefully all of that is clear. I would say some of the, while I don't often work on style, one of the things I did try to pick at were resemblances between the Psalter and Byzantine and late antique work, and I think you can see there are some nice parallels here. The Jonah shown here, and my favorite is this Byzantine necklace that you can see that the bird is wearing. I think is a very close match down to the little heart shapes. and the horn blower. So one of the things that's been done with the St. Andrew's sarcophagus is to think about comparative images of men and lions. And this was one of the first comparisons that was made. And I included, I don't know who this poor person is from the University of Alabama, Huntsville, but he's nice for size. So you can see it's quite an interesting stance. Other comparisons have been made with the silver dish Constantinople. And then finally, I think the closest is the Vespasian Psalter again. And hopefully you guys again can see that. So that brings me to my David from Psalm 7. He doesn't fit in very well with other psalters from the period. You can see the Utrecht Psalter's got just a lion with a kind of reclining man under it. The Kudov Psalter, poor old, the lion is definitely savaging the man. Quite a bloody way, those Byzantines. And here you can see, again, the closest comparison with the Corbie Psalter is the Vespasian Psalter in terms of the sort of approach to the treatment of the two figures and also the treatment of the story. The same sort of moment is being brought forth. Just going to check my time. Just moving on, I just wanted to, again, I don't usually talk about draperies and stuff, so I'm not very good at it. But I will just mention, you can see that the sort of, for example, the thing that struck me when I was looking at it is the shoe, and that sort of foot that's very gently sort of being dragged along. I have a, there, you can just see very nicely delineated foot, which seems to be a characteristic of these. Also the way that the clothes are sort of twisted over the body, and the sense, the thing that I think is here to a certain extent, but really a real strong feature of both the Corbie Psalter and the St. Andrew's sarcophagus is the way that the drapery seems to suggest the movement in a very delicate, sort of gentle movement. I think I've already sort of gone on slightly, I expected this to be like 5 minutes, so slightly longer than I have, but I will just point out to a couple of examples where this approach of maybe objects being just friends rather than being on a family tree has sort of helped me, and why I think the Corbie Psalter is so important, and I hope, again, that more of you will look at it. In terms of trying to sort out interlace and entangled figures, the Corbie Psalter was so useful because it was right next, the initial is right next to the psalm that says, you know, I'm entangled, you've tangled yourself up in knots, you wicked people, you know, the more you struggle, the less you're going to be free. So you could really clearly relate entanglement to sin, which, I mean, we could have guessed probably someone pulling on their genitals was not, you know, a sort of angelic figure. But with that, plus the Book of Kel's image, which is on the far right, which illuminates the word Pharisees and begins a verse where it talks about how the Pharisees and Sadducees have twisted Christ's words and failed to understand his words. These three together helped me sort of mount an argument, which is always very difficult, that ornament has meaning and that these aren't just sort of entangled figures for a decorative purpose. Equally, other work that's been really helpful and worth mentioning is the Psalter has so many commonalities with the Rothwell Cross in terms of its iconographic program that, again, I don't think we can afford to ignore it. And I've shown elsewhere, for example, the relationship between Christ and Mary Magdalene. And here you can see her, just a bit uglier, here down at Christ's feet. Although she doesn't have a face here, so. And also the Annunciation, or sorry, the Visitation panel, Mary and Martha. And also for my work, in terms of trying to understand the initial on the right, which was really tricky, it was essential to look at Nig, and this image from Nig. So again, I don't have time to sort of pursue this, and I've published it elsewhere, but I'm hoping that those of you who work on things like Nig might look more at the Corbie Psalter for possible answers. There certainly are relationships going on, not necessarily ones of influence, though. Again, I've shown you already this sort of nice draped foot and the similarities there. And again, these are just to show you some commonalities. We're now moving into the pretty picture section of my talk. So you can see the way that the tail twists and comes back through the leg and terminates in that kind of blossom, sort of a blossom-like tail. We find a parallel here. The treatment of fish and this motif of fish between dogs is very much like the Book of Kells. The question of Sasanian influence comes up with both of these. The griffins, the odd creatures, appears in both. And hopefully in the top initial, you can see what I mean by this fleshy, that's the fleshy nature of the initials. So yeah, these are the pretty pictures, as promised. Just again, the comparison. For those of you interested, I think Jane one time emailed me and said, do you know any birds and fish? And at the time I couldn't think, but here they are. Particularly, it's very badly damaged, but the image on the left is incredible of the eagles, the rising eagles with the fish. Again, entangled figures and also the interaction between word and image. If you're looking for a parallel with the Book of Kells, you can't find anything closer, I think, than the Corbie Psalter and the presence of angels. The emphasis on elevation, the elevation of the humble, and the humiliation of the sinful, of the wicked, and the necessity of penance are all themes that we find in insular art, which are articulated here. The naturalism and the emphasis on young animals suckling from older animals we find in the Corbie Psalter. And then finally, the end, although it's already been done for me, I'll just add to my, actually Carolingian art's quite good, because I think there were a few of us yesterday who were like, what? So I'm going to end with my opinion, which is, look at the Scottish manuscript, look at the Carolingian one. You know, that is, we can all cherry pick, and we must, I felt a bit like we're abused children, people who work on Scottish material, and now we're gonna abuse our children, so we must restrain ourselves and not sort of ape what's been done before and sort of follow down those false trails. And I think probably that was done tongue-in-cheek, but I did have to point that out. And just again, this is my favorite Carolingian manuscript. Some more, and I was going to say at this point I was going to add in another one with Scottish, a clear Scottish provenance, but there aren't any, yet there are hundreds of Carolingian manuscripts, although we could easily put up the Book of Kells. So anyway, so that's my end of my ramble, but thank you very much.